Welcome back to Beyond the Hyphen, where we explore the crossroads of politics, diplomacy, and global affairs. In this episode, we turn our focus to Congressman Sarah Elfreth, a trailblazer whose career reflects a deep commitment to public service, building a more equitable future, and the power of young voices in policymaking. As the youngest woman ever elected to the Maryland State Senate and now serving in Congress representing Maryland's 3rd Congressional District, Congresswoman Elfreth embodies a new generation of pragmatic, principled leadership. Congresswoman Elfreth, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you for inviting me, Mark. I'm excited.
Well, you have such a unique journey. I mean, from a non-political family background to now serving in national office. And along the way, you've championed issues from higher education all the way to healthcare. You were the youngest woman elected to the Maryland State Senate. And now, walking the steps of Congressman Sarbanes, who also made an appearance on our show, but also making your own footprints into the public policy and public service scene at the federal government. How has that transition shaped your own sense of representation and purpose?
Well, that's a really great question. A lot of ways I can take that. First of all, I loved my time in the Maryland Senate. 6 years. I represented a purple district, really tough first election in 2018. And it made me work so hard. I had political FOMO and attended every community picnic, high school graduation, neighborhood association, town hall meeting, just hyperdrive, wanting to, I think especially part of it was being a young person, wanting to prove myself even especially after I was elected, right? Like was on the campaign trail for about 498 days in my first election and then won, and then wanted to make sure people knew what kind of representative I was going to be. And to me, a lot of that was showing up everywhere, being a problem solver, focusing on constituent services, and being a legislator's legislator, so hyper-focused on policy. Obviously, much different at the federal level now. But I think the context too, not just the office has changed, the context of having President Trump back in office, different tenor, I think, than Trump won his first administration. I think he is much more aggressive in his agenda. He is much more successful in his agenda. And unfortunately, being a Marylander, and I represent 45,000 federal employees, represent a lot of immigrant families. I represent a whole lot of people who care about rule of law, represent a lot of active duty military and veterans. A lot of the decisions being made out of this White House disproportionately and acutely impact our district. And what that means, kind of being a Democratic member of Congress when we're 3 seats shy of the majority, and being in a triple majority, House, Senate, and White House, triple minority rather, it's a much different job than my time in the state Senate, because the tools I have at my disposal are much different.
Right.
But something Congressman Sarbanes told me when we were transitioning, and he was very gracious and helpful when I won my primary to being sworn in. Still, we're having coffee next week. Was especially during a Trump presidency, a huge part of my job is pastoring to my constituents. And kind of I rationally understood what he meant, but I've experienced it almost every day being a member of Congress. People have always come to me, and as a state senator now here, on their worst days, when they've lost their job or they can't pay their BG&E bill or they need help with something. And my job has always been to try to solve it, or if I can't, at the very least, make them feel heard. Now it's a little bit different. It's that plus making them feel more optimistic, or at least less anxious about all the existential questions we all have. Like, how do we keep our communities safe, especially our immigrant neighbors? How can we support people who've lost their jobs after careers of dedicated public service? How do we have free, fair, and secure elections in November, right? All of these anxieties, a huge part of my job now that I don't have all the legislative tools I once had in the state Senate is to simply be there for people and try to be a beacon of hope, even when I don't feel hopeful. It's really important that I keep people motivated on how we turn this ship around. And that's a lot to do with what happens in November. So that's a huge difference, I think, in the jobs.
Yeah, and you mentioned being a beacon of hope even when, yourself might not have that.
Trying, yes.
Right. Have that. And I think you're doing a great job being in your district, right? I think you're a leader to be looked up to, absolutely. And for young people, we are constantly looking for that leader who not only operates in their own way for young people, but with young people, right? You've worked closely with local, national leaders. How do you think the current, I would say, political atmosphere under this administration is shaping the way young people view democracy itself, right? What factors do you think play that role in influencing the younger generation?
That's a good question. I think context again is important here because for folks like you who are almost in voting age, and for young voters, and people just in their 20s, their almost entire political consciousness has been under a Trump presidency or with kind of Trump in the background, from 2015 to today. So they didn't ever really get to consciously experience like what a functional government with President Obama looked like, or a certainly less divisive government in context of today. So that's something it's important people like me acknowledge that the young people just don't even have that reference point all the time. And so how do we communicate that this has functioned well, right? Like this used to be a place that functioned, that the divisiveness of today's politics are utterly unacceptable. I had a really great opportunity. There have not been a lot of like fun, joyful moments for me this Congress, but former Speaker Pelosi arranged for a meeting between the freshman class and President Obama. And it was just us for about an hour. And he spoke so eloquently about this issue of rejecting the culture of the divisiveness of today's politics. So I think it's like communicating that this is unacceptable, and that it used to be better and it can be better again, that optimistic note. And then I think it's also making people feel seen and heard, that we care about the issues that are important to them as well. And I think this is a tricky kind of balance because, a frustration I've always had as an elected official is people get angry with me when I don't agree with them or they don't agree with me 100% of the time. And I respond to this, that when I get that, like, how dare you not champion this, or how dare you voted this way. And my response is, my mother doesn't agree with all of my votes. And in no relationship in your life or my life have we ever agreed with a partner, a friend, a parent, a sibling 100% of the time. And I think that's important too for young people to wrap their heads around, that like politicians are human beings. We are wildly imperfect. We are, for the most part, I would like to believe we are doing our best. And that I think I would hope that they feel that optimism and hope in politicians who are choosing to maybe not entirely focus on issues young people care about, but at least recognizing that those are policy issues like student loans, right? Like I have a tremendous amount of money in student loans that I've chipped away at for the last 15 years, but that's something that your generation is also going to have to deal with. So like, how do I focus on prioritizing policy that makes it easier for people to achieve a higher education affordably? Or buying your first house. It took me until 37 to buy my first house. And that feels old, but I also beat the curve because the average right now in this country is 40. Right. But it's still an issue that young people care about. So I think, recognizing that there are a group of young, especially younger members of Congress who are trying to champion these issues, and like find a cause or a politician that you care about as a young person. And I keep going back to this optimism, like try to lean in and participate on something that makes you feel optimistic about the state of affairs right now.
Yeah, and it's super interesting looking at the gap between, there's a lot of kids and students and college students, even postgrads, who are interested in getting involved into politics or, seeking their first seat in elected office, things like that. And for you, you've broken so many barriers before. Like I mentioned earlier, as the youngest woman ever elected to the Maryland Senate, and now in Congress serving in your 30s, facing these realities that might present themselves as barriers for our young listeners, whether they are young women who are in the shoes that you were in years ago, or coming from a family without a political background. How has that shaped how you define credibility? or strength in this space?
Well, I think I'm gonna turn that into, because I just met with my interns, who have been so helpful to our office and our district office, which is located in Columbia, and our DC office as well. And so they asked me like what advice I would give young people in this space. And number one, to your point about feeling a certain way about being a younger person or a woman or a person of color in any room, and I'm sure you've heard of imposter syndrome, imposter theory. And my response to when students or young people ask me about that, because I was 30 when I was elected to the Maryland Senate, and mostly in a chamber of 70s, 60s, 50s, a couple people in their 40s, and like three of us in our 30s. And my response to them is, I had a really tough first election, and I worked my bleep off to get there and earn the trust of my constituents, just like every other 46 of them, there's 47 in the Senate, did. And I earned my seat at that table. And so I didn't have imposter syndrome because I knew that I, worked and had a legitimate cause to be there. And my advice is to combat that feeling, which is totally reasonable and natural, is to ensure that like, that you've worked hard to be in that room or in that conversation or in that space. So that's number one. Number two, and I just told this to my interns the other day, I think like being curious is really important. Just like generally speaking, as a lifelong learner, it's important to be curious. But I think in politics, it's so helpful because I think we have an obligation to like try to see the other person's point of view. It makes our case, if I care about an issue, it helps me make my case stronger if I understand where you're coming from, even if I'm not going to convince you that I'm right or you're wrong. But being curious about how you got there, I think helps bridge this gap and this divide that we have in this country right now, and that we all have I certainly have a high obligation to help bridge. But I think everybody does, and that's something I think young people can certainly also help us champion too.
Right. Yeah, I think the role that young people play it isn't really clearly defined in a lot of the times, and I think that seeing someone that might not be, in their 60s, 50s, or 70s is definitely helpful, because a lot of the barriers is them feeling as if their man or woman is not approachable, right? Their senator is not approachable.
Yeah.
And so that sort of walks me into our next question, which is, how do we shape our young people's outlook? And one of those factors is the economic uncertainty that a lot of young people are facing with rising costs, like you mentioned earlier, student debt, limiting access to, houses, financial opportunity. What might economic policy look like, either, short term from your perspective or long term, in the effort towards this reform for security? And what areas do you think may be of utmost priority in the present?
Yeah, this is a really challenging issue because I think policy challenges aren't ever stagnant. Like they keep moving. And this is a great example of, we've always, not always, in the last 30 years in particular, we've had this student debt balloon of a challenge, right? And then you have at the same time housing prices and costs being further and further out of reach for everybody, but particularly young people who might not have that wealth built up. And at the same time, you have great job insecurity, particularly with the advent of AI, which scares me for a lot of reasons. But one of them, energy, water issues, hugely important, problems that AI is creating. But one of them is job displacement. And what is that going to look like for young people coming out of high school, coming out of college? So how are we thinking about building an economy and a workforce that is as resilient to that as possible? And a part of that is going back to and having an education system that is much more nimble. I got, one of the things I started as a young person in politics was in student government at Towson University, and then as student member of the Board of Regents for the University System of Maryland. And, you're in high school now, but when you get to college, you're going to see colleges and universities are really resistant to change. Mm-hmm. And they are really big ships that do not turn easily. And when we have what's approaching us in this what's going to be an economic revolution, like it or not, with AI and job displacement? How are we building an education system, K through 12 and higher ed, that can help respond to job changes? So thinking through things like we need much more skilled labor than we ever have. And yet for the last 50 years, we've been telling people they can only go to college or be unsuccessful. So like, how are we making trades and skilled labor cool again? Because we're always going to need plumbers. We're always going to need steam fitters. We're always going to need, I'm very into shipbuilding these days. We're always going to need people to build things.
Right.
And how are we reprioritizing that? And that's a policy issue too. In addition to the affordability stuff, that's just about making it easier for families to thrive. Like, we forget, if you watch The Simpsons, we forget that when The Simpsons was created, you could have a middle class lifestyle with only one parent who was working and like be okay with 3 kids. And that's just so out of reach for so many young people these days. And we just need to figure out policies that really support low and middle income folks' ability to thrive. So childcare affordability, huge, higher education affordability, housing affordability, all these things. Like, how do we even provide access and opportunity for young people again?
Yeah. Yeah. And a lot of that, I think, begins, you mentioned you were the student member of the board on the Board of Regents. Counties across Maryland, they have student members of the board and the state student member of the board of education. When you were on the Board of Regents, Congresswoman Elfreth, you voted against a tuition increase and later pushed, for reforms, expanding oversight of that same body in the Maryland Senate. Those are 2 different levers. And you mentioned that universities can be quite stagnant, one from the inside and one through legislation during your time in the Senate, right? Which one actually felt, I'm curious, more effective in terms of changing the outcome?
Oh, higher education is a lot harder to change.
Okay.
From the inside. I part of the reason I love being a legislator and love policy is how, relative to other tools, quickly you can create change. And yeah, I took up that reform to the Board of Regents bill my first session as a state senator. And I'm not going to name names here. Another member of the General Assembly was interested in reform, and I just outran that person. And like, brought more people to the table in a collaborative way for that bill, got it drafted faster, had it heard like, I just outgunned my counterpart to get that bill through. But higher education is really tough to change, for good and for bad. I think there's a reason American higher education is the way it is. I wrote a book when I was student regent on what it means to be a student member, a SMOB, a student member of a board. And it starts with the history of shared governance in America, which is actually kind of created by Thomas Jefferson at University of Virginia. And this idea to have what's called lay governing boards, where government isn't in charge of higher education policy, citizens are. And then, fast forward to the 1960s and 1970s, where there were movements across this country to add a student to those boards. And my book talks about this a little bit. But it's so important. When I was writing the book, I interviewed every other student member of a board across the country. And one student, I'm totally blanking on who it was, said to me, because not to this day in 2026, not every higher education board has a student member. And even if you have a student member, not necessarily a voting member.
Right.
Somebody said to me, arguing for having a voting student member, what does that say about how you view the quality of the education you're providing these students if you don't have faith in their ability to be a like fully participating, educated, honest, hardworking member of the board? Like, that is a reflection of the education that you're providing. And that's a reason to have that SMOB. And I loved that response. And, I represent Howard County, Anne Arundel County, Carroll County. Anne Arundel County, full voting member of the board. Carroll County does not have it. I don't believe they have a student. In Anne Arundel County's Board of Education, if you ask the other adult board members, they will tell you without a doubt that student member is the most well-read, well-prepared, like balanced, reasonable member of that board year after year after year. And I'm sure that's the same in Howard County. But it's such, it's a privilege to watch young people take on those roles and responsibilities with such like passion and focus and professionalism when they're 17, 18. It's a thrill for me as a former SMOB to see that.
Yeah, yeah, and sticking on, I mean, I won't go into it too much. I have some experience being in that process. It is very, rigorous and demanding. But I think at the end of the day, the spirit is to have student representation,
Yeah.
and that's the most important, I think, part of it.
Yeah.
For you, Congresswoman Elfreth, zooming out a bit, as the chair of the Chesapeake Executive Council, you were working across state lines to push funding for things like agricultural cleanup. Looking ahead, what does success look like in that aspect? Because environmental stability, environmental preservation is such a cornerstone issue for young people, for the next generation. So what does policy look like on that front as of right now?
I love the way you asked that question, because I'm going to respond to it with more of a theory of governing that I think is so important to the sustainability of policy, which is a weird choice of words when we're talking about the environment. But what I mean by sustainability policy, I mean policy that's going to last.
Right.
And we have a problem in this country, we talked about it earlier, of like first of all, there's always a pendulum that swings in policy, right? And political power swings constantly back and forth. We'll see in November, but I don't know the last time there was a sitting president of one party who didn't lose the midterm election for his party 2 years after they won, right? So like the pendulum swings. And what happens when you have a changing government every 2 or 4 years is that policy doesn't get to be long lasting. And that has crazy policy effects everywhere, but particularly on the environment, right? If we are too aggressive in one thing, in one policy area on anything, and we don't take the time to bring the majority of people along. And I say majority, obviously you need a majority of a vote, but you also want to bring the public along with you so that they have faith and understanding of why that policy choice was made. Right. A great example of this is in 2014, before I was in the state Senate, stormwater fee, which was a huge issue, hugely contentious issue. But the basic idea of it is if you own a home or a business and you have impervious surface, that is going to lead to greater stormwater runoff of like all the gross things that are on the roads into tributaries that then flow into the Chesapeake Bay. So we want more pervious. We want more surfaces that can help drain and help in the end create clean water. The General Assembly at the time was so aggressive in 2014 with that, or maybe it was 2012, it was before I was in the General Assembly, with that stormwater fee. It got dubbed by Republicans as the rain tax. You might not remember this, but it was called the rain tax. Governor Larry Hogan ran on it, had whole commercials about how Democrats just want to tax the rain. Like no one took the time to explain to people how important that policy issue was. And as a result, we got a Republican governor, significant efforts to roll back that important policy. And in the end, like a less sustainable, successful policy, because we didn't take the time to educate the public about why it's important. And I take the time to explain that because I think it's important when we talk about how do we get to long-term environmental policy success, is we have to bring people along with us. And I did a lot of work in Pennsylvania, a lot of work with Republicans in Pennsylvania, farmers in Pennsylvania. And I always try to frame it as they don't have access to the Chesapeake Bay like you and I have, because it doesn't exist in Pennsylvania. They have the Susquehanna River and the tributaries that run into it. But the things that they care about, if we solve for them, instead of forcing them to try to care about the Chesapeake Bay, which they never will, they don't care about oysters or blue crabs, they don't have them. Why don't we try to solve for the issues they care about that will have because everything flows downward, a resounding impact on us. So if we care about sustainable agriculture and healthy soil, right, that's going to lead to more productive farms and greater profit for farmers and less runoff, like great, they love it, and it has downstream impacts. They also care about flooding issues, right? They also care about stormwater management in the small towns they have. If we solve for those and bring them along with us, we're going to have more sustainable policy that is going to have downstream positive environmental impacts for us here in Maryland and Virginia. So I think that's an angle to think about, especially as young people. it's important to be bold in our policy vision, but we also have to sell it in a way that's going to last beyond one bill, legislative session, or one term.
That is so interesting. I think a lot of young people, and even not, like, have that desire for immediate change just because a lot of things come so quickly.
And that's important. It's totally like, and especially with like the looming impact or threat of climate change, which isn't even looming. I mean, it's 85 degrees out in April right now, right? It's crazy. We have to solve for climate change now. But if we don't do it in a way that is going to bring everybody with, not everybody, but like a majority amount of this country with us, what happens is then the balance of power shifts back, the pendulum shifts back, and we start to have a Trump president who's unraveling all of the ground that we gained over the last couple of decades when it comes to renewable energy generation, when it comes to like even using the words climate change in government documents. Like, we have to think about sustainable ways to create policy.
Yeah, absolutely. And Congresswoman, as we wind down, I had one last question for you. I know ICE was a very, very big issue, and even still is in states like Maryland. And you can see a lot of high schools leading walkouts and young people participating. When issues around ICE detention facilities and conditions in Maryland came up earlier this year, you stepped in publicly along with your colleagues in Congress. In moments like that, what's your message to the younger facet of that advocacy wave about when and how to speak up on issues that might be quote dangerous to talk about or sensitive to talk about that are affecting their communities?
I think it's a good lesson for all of us to think about the fundamental problem we're solving for, right? Is that we have neighbors who are no longer safe or no longer feel safe. Neighborhoods, one or both. So what can we do as individuals, young or my age or older, to help solve for that? And I think it's, yes, speaking up and, participating, which I talk about all the time, especially as we go into the 250th anniversary of the founding of this country. This whole system was built on participation, and that is what got us to this place. And that's what's going to get us out of this current divisive nature of politics is everybody leaning in and participating as much as possible. But I think my answer to you as a high schooler who has no doubt neighbors and friends and classmates who themselves or their families, because many people are living in mixed status households. What can you do beyond the participating? I think it's like, be a good friend, be a good neighbor, be there for, just like I am, and try to be every day, be there for your neighbors on their hardest days. So sometimes that means asking people how they're feeling. Sometimes that means helping connect people to an attorney. Sometimes that means, if God forbid somebody has been detained, how do you help the family that remains, right? How are you making sure people can continue to keep a roof over their heads and food on the table and just being there for our neighbors during this really difficult time? I think that's something all of us can and should do. And you have that natural ecosystem of being in a high school and having a support system that can be built in these really, really difficult times for people.
Well, thank you so much, Congressman Elfreth, for your insights and perspectives. And thank you so much, for taking the time to join us on a busy Tuesday and for sharing your insights, not just on government, but as a community of citizens, like you talked about, all with very, very niche roles and important roles in our civic infrastructure.
I really appreciate it, Mark. I got to go run to the floor to vote. It's 6:30. They just called us. If you can't hear the bells ringing, I really appreciate you asking me to be on, and best of luck with your future interviews. And let me know if I can ever be of help to you in your, what is clearly a very bright future career already.
Thank you for joining us.
Of course. Thanks.